Good morning, friends on Zoom and on YouTube. We'll begin our daily devotional in just a few minutes or a few moments. Good morning, friends on Facebook. We'll begin our live devotional in just a moment. Good morning and welcome, pilgrims and friends and neighbors, for joining us here this Thursday morning for our daily devotional. I'm Patrick Horn from Pilgrim Congregational Church, and this morning we're going to be looking more closely at our passage for the week, which is Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 through 11. And this morning I want us to look closely with verse 3 and compare it to the passage in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. So we know that this passage from Isaiah has been used by many, and perhaps most famously by Handel and Handel's Messiah. And we know too that the context for the original Isaiah passage is for the Israelite people after being released from captivity in Babylon. And there has been, of course, some excitement about that release, but there's also the reality of the challenges that face the Israelite people, and they are nearly overcome with the weight and the depression of having to rebuild a city and a nation. And so these verses come as great comfort to the people of Israel. And many people have recognized the power of this passage, including John the Baptist, as recorded in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And so I want us to read Isaiah 40, verse 3, and then to look at the first chapter of the Gospel of John. So Isaiah 40, verse 3 says, "A voice cries out, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." So remember that the description of what's taking place here in Isaiah 40 is of a council meeting in heaven that the prophet is allowed to sit in on. And there are these various voices that we hear. And the prophet records that he heard a voice cry out, and the voice said, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Now, I want us to compare that with the Gospel of John, which John chapter 1, verse 23, which is the passage that we may be even more familiar with, or at least the way that Isaiah is structured here in the Gospel of John. So Isaiah, or I should say John 1, verse 23. This is John the Baptist speaking when he's being asked but he's being interrogated essentially by some men that had been sent by the priest and the Levites of Jerusalem to interrogate John the Baptist and what he's doing. Verse 23, he said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said." So we have this discrepancy about how to put these words together. And apparently the text, or the way that John the Baptist or the author of the Gospel of John was taught the book of Isaiah, the way that you read that Isaiah passage is, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. But in the ancient manuscripts that we have of Isaiah, the most reliable manuscripts that we have, the reading of the passage is the prophet is sitting at the heavenly council and he hears a voice cry out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord." That is, the way of the Lord should be prepared through the wilderness, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So it's later that this passage is come to be read as a voice crying in the wilderness, but that's not what our most reliable manuscripts make out of this passage. So you have this very interesting contrast in the reading, and they are technically and grammatically, they're very different readings of this text. There are many people, I think, that might be deeply bothered by this and would work very hard, especially some Christians, I think, that might work very hard to make this work. But I think most scholars have pretty well settled on the fact that these are just two different readings of this passage of Isaiah. I think this is really important for us on a spiritual level because it communicates several things about the Bible. One is that there are differences of interpretation of the Bible, obviously, that we have, but there are differences of interpretation of the Bible within the Bible itself when other passages are quoted. This is very important for our understanding and appreciation for the Bible. And perhaps most powerfully, it's the recognition that God's message of, in this case, of comfort and of the Lord coming to us, that in this effort, God is not restrained by our in this Isaiah, I'm sorry, we're having some technical difficulties here. Let's see. Okay, see if everybody, okay. So in this Isaiah passage and in the John passage, there is a continuity that's very strong. We talked about in the Bible study on Tuesday night about how the message combines the old and the new. And most powerfully, that God speaks to us where we are, that the message of the gospel is not something that is static for every generation. The message of the gospel speaks to each generation and even to each individual, responding precisely to the need of that individual. And I think this is simply a very powerful message for the Advent season. That is, that the message of the gospel is not restrained by our interpretations, certainly not restrained by our misunderstandings of the text. The message of the Bible is the message of the gospel is powerful for each moment and each time if we will simply be open to it and receptive of it. Let's close with this word of prayer from the 19th century minister Samuel Macomb. Eternal God, lead us into the blessedness of the mystery of communion with Thee. Bow our spirits in deepest reverence before Thee, yet lift us up into a sense of kinship with Thee. Send the Spirit of Thy Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, that all unworthy fear may be banished by the gladness of Thy perfect love. Thy love is like the luminous heaven, receiving only to purify the foulest breath of earth. Thy gentleness is like the sun, seeking to cheer and warm the chilled hearts of humanity. Touch us, O our God, with a feeling of Thy great realities. For though our thought about Thee is better than our words, our experience of Thee is better than our thought. Amen. Thank you for joining me this morning from Pilgrim Congregational Church. I'm Patrick Horn. I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.